Well, hello everybody. Stefan again. This is another short, Cove short, and we're going to talk a little bit about the realities of disaster recovery, cyber recovery, whatnot. Okay? So, there's a couple of myths maybe floating around or some vendors pitching different things like, of course, if you're not doing cloud-first data protection, right? So pretty much anybody other than maybe Druva, Haiku, and, of course, Cove, right, that have that architectural approach will, of course, say or try to seed some doubt in terms of the viability of sending data directly to the cloud and, how's that viable for a real a disaster recovery solution, which of course is actually quite not true, and au contraire, it might actually be preferable. It provides definitely that architecture provides a lot of advantages. We'll talk a little bit about what those are, and then the second thing you'll hear is that there's a lot of over-rotation towards instant gratification. I'm going to instantly produce that copy. It's going to just spin it up somehow magically, pixie dust, right? And the reality is, it's great. That's a nice thing if you can do that, but it's almost always not practical in an actual disaster recovery, right? And it's definitely not practical after a cyber attack, right? So it depends on the disaster. So diving in. Let's talk about what different types of disasters are you even recovering from, right? So just to think that there's a one-size-fits-all, not realistic, right? There's going to be different solutions that are specialized on recovering from different types of disaster. I didn't list here logical corruption, but that clearly happens. If Stefan goes ahead and, messes something up, that's certainly one type of disaster, but that's probably more of a failure. But disaster typically is something of a greater magnitude. And when you think about the vendors that are out there in the market, Datto, Veeam, storage vendors like EMC and so forth, they've really built their solutions over the decades to largely remediate against traditional disasters. You got a flood, you got a power outage. Maybe there's even something bigger like a tornado, something that's, regional, right? So the impact of the disaster could be in a data center, could be in Iraq, excuse me, or it could also be something that's like a little bit more, regional, like I said, catastrophic. And so therefore the topology, right, the architecture would be, I got a product, a set of storage and servers and backup targets in this data center, but in order to remediate to something that's regional, obviously I'm going to pluck another copy, if you will, in another data center in some other location, right, where there's still power, where the impact of the weather may not be so much, right? And in these traditional topologies, the race was really around how do I get the smallest RPO and the smallest RTO possible. So as close to instant recovery, as close to instant recovery points, right, with a fine granularity. And then ideally, when there's an issue in my data center, let's say somewhere in Boston, that I could just switch over to the data center in Raleigh, Durham, or something like that, right, and then just could resume operations, right? And typically in those disasters, and when I respond to those disasters, I would do a bulk failover. Everything that's running in this data center, I'm basically just going to spin up my copy or have the copy that's in that other data center take over, run the application, and off I go, right? So it's really a failover, failback type of scenario, very comprehensive, all the data, everything that's associated with it, I'm off to the races. Now, when you're recovering from a cyber attack, that's very different. So the advent of these nasty ransomware attacks, whether that's WannaCry, NotPetya, you name it, have taught us that traditional disaster recovery topologies actually don't work really well. It's the same underlying technology, but the architectures didn't lend themselves. It couldn't just be applied to, hey, let's recover from that NotPetya, because the problem is the traditional disaster architecture requires that these copies, these arrays, these appliances are highly connected. But the problem is when they're highly connected, the malware makes it through the network very effectively. So if you can corrupt the first copy, you're automatically very quickly going to corrupt the second copy. So the whole thing that you spend a lot of money on is highly ineffective. So what's good for a flood and a power outage is actually not effective against a cyber attack, which is why you need isolation, you need sort of the same mechanisms, but your architecture needs to be very different. The other thing that's fascinating is that cyber attacks also taught us that you're not going to be able to reliably or instantly recover, right? Because you will have to think about, is it safe to recover this copy into production? Because what if it contains malware? I'm just going to rehydrate the malware into the production network, and I'm going to have a problem. Or I'm going to contaminate the crime scene, right? Whenever there's an incident, they're going to look at what's going on. Can I contain it? The last thing you want to do is restore some bad stuff into the crime scene to compromise any evidence and so forth, right? The last thing I'll say is that the recovery of the data when it comes to a cyber event is not bulk. It's not like a failback of an entire data center, but typically security folks will ask you to restore a very specific piece of information. It could be a file, it could be a virtual machine, right? So it's much more granular, and often it's more iterative. This copy isn't good. Go to yesterday's copy, also not good. Go to the copy the day before and so forth, right? Until you find a good known state, and then that's what you're going to unleash into production. So different disasters, right, require different solutions. So anyone who says, hey, I'm Datto, I'm just going to have this instant access button and is full of it, right? Because it is not honoring the different types of disasters that we're going to have to recover from. Okay, so knowing that, let's talk a little bit about that cyber scenario, because it's the lesser maybe known and the more emerging one, and frankly, it's the one that kind of keeps us all up at night. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but there are different things that happen in a cyber attack, right? One, you might get a business email compromise, and then they'll look in the network, try to find the weak spots, steal someone's credentials, and then they're going to go ahead and destroy the infrastructure or do whatever it is, right? So they typically divide between left of boom, so anything from breach, right, to compromise, to things like credential harvesting, right, to when they actually do the bad stuff, which is the boom, I encrypt your data. That is typically when you're going to have to now respond. So the left of breach is really all about, how do I keep stuff out? Can I use my EDR solution, right, that we obviously sell, right? Can I filter so I can block access to malicious sites and so forth, right? It's all about perimeter control, good hygiene, patching, right, are all things that are really relevant to the left of boom. But at the end of the day, when bad stuff happens, and it can happen, it will happen, right, we're going to need to restore some data, right? The good thing is Enable actually covers both ends. That's kind of one of the points. And with Cove, we actually have a very robust tool that can do the data recovery, but the data recovery will happen always in the context of an incident response. Cyber attack happens, security folks come in, right? So those are typically security professionals, and they'll do a variety of things, bring in, lawyers if that needs to happen, sort of people that do some criminal investigation if that needs to happen. And then as part of that entire process, they're going to ask you as backup Bob, as we often refer to the persona, to restore some data, right? So that's something that needs to be understood. So there's no instant recovery here. It happens, it needs to be coordinated, and that coordination is often overlooked, right? So if you don't even know who the person is on the security side, and you haven't even practiced the recovery of data, probably you're a little bit exposed. Okay, so then we have to think about, okay, that's great. So I understand my fit, especially when it comes to recovering from a cyber attack. But the real question then also becomes is, how do I make sure those copies that I'm then going to use to restore my business, that they're not in the attack vector? So when you look at Datto, when you look at Veeam and countless other backup vendors, they all have the same problem. Their backup infrastructure, their backup server, and the backup target sits on the same network as the malware, the ransomware that's going to compromise the application data, right? So you can see these different attack vectors. We don't have to go deep, but you can imagine app server, maybe that's running a couple of critical VMs. And of course, if that's not patched, well, you're going to have a vulnerability, and therefore that's going to be the perfect entry point for the malware. But if you think that the malware and the ransomware is only going to worry about corrupting your Active Directory or domain controller, you're wrong. Actually, time and time again, and if you Google Conti ransomware group, they are specialized on going after the backup infrastructure, including the backup catalog and the backup target. Why? Well, think about it. If I can take out your Active Directory, you can no longer run your applications, and I'm really crippling your business. The next thing you're going to try to do is recover your data, right? So I'm going to use my backup infrastructure for that. But guess what? If I can take that out, now I really have you in a state where it's much more likely for me as the bad actor to extort money from you, because most of these are financially motivated, right? So, and then lastly, of course, the IT administrator, if I can get the right credentials, I can pretend that I'm Stefan Voss at Enable, and with the right privileges, I can actually go after this architecture as well, right? So it's also important to make sure that we have technologies to remediate against the sort of this exploit of pretending that I'm someone who really shouldn't have these privileges. All right, so this is your typical infrastructure. So this backup target could be your Datto appliance or the NetApp filer. The backup server is the Datto, software or the Veeam software, right? And if I can take that out, you're going to have a hard time recovering, right? So why would we not consider moving this outside of the network of the customer and into the cloud, right, where it's protected? I basically just removed two key attack vectors. The place where the backup copies live, which is the storage, and the backup application with all the backup catalog, all the metadata that I would need to restore. So I immediately reduced my attack surface just by way of having a more elegant architecture, which is cloud first, right? And so apart from the sort of ease of use benefits, you're really now reducing your attack surface significantly. And oh, by the way, if somebody actually did somehow steal the right credentials, pretending that this person is Stefan.Voss at enable.com, well, because we support multi-factor authentication, it's going to be a lot harder to do because they're going to want to see that token on the iPhone or however you're going to do your multi-factor authentication method. And arguably, this attack vector is also remediated. Now, when you look at some of the government guidance, whether that's the executive order, whether that is FBI guidance, whether that is the regulations in Europe, right? They all say the same thing, which is you got to have multi-factor authentication as a best practice, right? And it is a best practice also to have your backup copies offline. Well, this is what we deliver by default. So that has to be an advantage over our beloved competitors like Datto, Veeam, and so forth, who always force you to have a copy on site first and then bolt on a cloud copy as a way to remediate against that, adding complexity, right? So what we then do is kind of creative. We actually turn it the other way around. So if you want to shorten your recovery time objective, right, we have the ability to put a standby image of that business critical virtual machine on a target of your choice, right? So we don't force you to hop through an on-premise copy to then replicate it into the cloud, but we actually turn it the other way around. We always get it off-site, get the data in the safe spot, but then we can put it on a standby image on a machine that's in your data or a file share that's in your network, and soon we're going to put it on an Azure tenant. So you can have a lot of flexibility, which is In addition to kind of minimizing your investment and complexity, it's also a nice degree of flexibility. Because what if your security folks that ask you to restore some data don't want you to put the data on the same appliance that happens to be on the production network? What if they want to put it in a sandbox where they often operate to do some cleaning? Well, this architecture allows you to do that. You can have that server be wherever you want. A lot of flexibility. You get the principles of faster, sort of recovery, right? Short RTOs. But what we're really designing for is, by default, reducing your attack vector, which is a big plus. Again, thanks a lot. More information here.